Much, Vicky. Hi, everyone who decided to tune in for this event. Thank you all so much for coming. My name is Spencer Asch. I'm a junior at NYU Stern, majoring in business and political economy. At DC, I'm a global leadership student. Michael-Scott, if you want to also introduce yourself before we get to the panelists.
Hi, I'm Michael-Scott. I am one of the co-moderators for this event, formerly a student at NYU DC. Since I have been back in New York. And I guess we should kick it off to the panelists. So Hansford, you were here first. If you would please introduce yourself.
Absolutely. Good evening, everyone. Hansford Johnson, Director at Travelers. I oversee our diversity, engagement, and talent strategies across our enterprise. Prior to joining Travelers, I worked at a global health service company and pretty much had the same function there, but also led our university relations recruiting. And then prior to that, I spent 10 years in higher education. So very acquainted with the work that Vicky does. Worked at Yale University, Wake Forest University, and University of South Florida, leading the staff function. So admissions, student affairs, career services, all that good stuff. So looking forward to the call today, or I should say the conversation today.
Great, thank you. Mambu, if you also want to give us a short introduction.
Hey, hi everyone. Mambu Sherman. I am the Vice President of Global Philanthropy at Jpmorgan Chase, where I oversee grant-making activities for part of the Midwest region covering Chicago, Indiana, and Wisconsin. And that includes all our corporate responsibility work for small businesses, inclusive financial health, jobs and skills readiness, and neighborhood revitalization. I'm also an MBA student at NYU Stern in the executive MBA program in DC. Glad to be here this evening.
Very good. Thank you both so much for joining us this evening. I'm sure you have plenty of other responsibilities during this very challenging and unique time in the business world and in the world in general. But this panel is really focusing on, leadership and management in crisis. Hopefully you have some very interesting insights to share on that. So I guess we'll start with pretty much the basics. How has COVID thus far affected your ability to do your job on a day-to-day basis?
Oh, wow. Man, I mean, it's affected quite a bit. For me, in our organization at Travelers, we do have a lot of folks who do work, remotely. My particular job is focused on, human interaction, and engagement externally. So it's affected it tremendously, and working with the different community-based organizations, colleges and universities and associations. So it's affected quite a bit. But in the sense that, we're kind of positioned for this type of, work where we're able to communicate, engage over, channels, I should say, platforms like this. We were kind of ready for it. But again, it has made it a little interesting. I wouldn't say made it difficult, to get the job done. But again, not able to really engage, externally. But like I said before, we were positioned for this as an organization. So yeah, we're adapting quite nicely.
Very good. Mambu, what about you?
I mean, it's the complexity of not just the work, but now having to deal with the complexity of working and the complexity of home and home life. Right. I think adds just another dimension of the challenge. Working for a company that's the largest bank in the country, every part of our business has been impacted. All of our business lines have been impacted. Our consumer banking, our asset management, and in my role at CR, I'm kind of touching all of it. I'm touching what's happening with the economy and in our sector, in the banking sector. But my work also touches what's happening in communities and with entrepreneurs and small businesses. Mm-hmm. So there's this wide spectrum, and there's kind of competing narratives in what's happening in my work. There's the narrative happening in responding to small businesses and trying to be as hyper responsive and keep up with things changing, which is almost by the hour, while also touching what's happening in other sectors, whether it's healthcare, banking, finance. So we're seeing changes in work evolving across the board, really by the day.
Right.
And so it's caused to be really adaptive, and hyper responsive to those changes.
So this panel is part of a course called The Meaning of Leadership.
Yeah.
So this is going to be a broad strokes question. Any way you interpret is fine. How do you, Hansford or Mambu?
You froze for a minute there. All we heard was how do you? Did you hear, Mambu, the question?
I didn't hear the.
Yeah, Michael-Scott, if you could just
Repeat the question.
Repeat the question. Michael-Scott, are you there?
He's frozen.
We'll give him a sec to reconnect, but I guess I could also, oh, it looks like Michael-Scott is back. Can you hear us?
Yeah, I'm all good.
Okay. Do you want to repeat the question for the panelists?
Yeah, my audio is a little spotty, so definitely do let me know if I freeze or you just don't hear the questions. And if I do drop off again, Spencer, feel free to take the reins.
Yeah, definitely.
So like, how do you define leadership? How do you see leadership? I know, Hansford, you said Travelers was very well prepared for this. How does your leadership impact what you're doing now going forward as we go through this time of crisis?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. I mean, leadership is, gosh, pretty broadly, it's, the ability to lead, and to influence. And I think, the situation, that we're in right now really tests that, because I think there's a lot of theory, about what leadership is, and you're all in school and you're studying it, but it gets tested, the practical application of it, when you're tested with crisis like this, because it really pushes against, your core values, your beliefs and what you say, and particularly working for an organization that is a for-profit organization, you really have to be able to demonstrate, when you say, people over profits, and really live that out, So, I mean, here at Travelers, I mean, one of the things that we always talk about, that's core to who we are is, our Travelers Promise. And that's really, we're an insurance, financial services, or risk management company. So if you think about it, we're there when things like this happen, like, Hurricane Katrina or whatever it may be. So our promise is, to our customers, our clients, our brokers, is really to be there for them in situations like this. So what an opportunity to really demonstrate that. And we put it really in three buckets, look for our employees, being there for our employees, our communities, and our customers, So again, I'm sure we'll probably go into, some more questions around those particular things, but it's in crisis moments like this that I think leadership is really tested. It exposes the cracks, that you have. It exposes, your ability and really your, what your core principles and values are, in that. So, but again, leadership is ability to lead, the ability to influence. And again, not just in the position that we're in right now, but in moments of crisis, when everything is not as measured or as prescriptive as it should be, how do you align with those particular guidelines that you have, and those things that kind of move the organization forward, and how you're able to influence people like that in moments like this, when they're dealing with things that's personal. How are you able to influence them and keep moving forward?
I love that.
Beat that.
And I echo those same sentiments. I think it's hard to have a definition of leadership, because I believe leadership looks different for everyone, based on function, level, where you are. I do believe there are core principles that transcend industry and transcend function. One of them being really just being human-centered, having a human-centered lens and prioritizing people, empathy, really understanding the nuances and the challenges the people that you're leading are facing. I think another core principle is having, the only word that comes to mind is wisdom, and not to throw out this heavy philosophical term, but really the ability to assess a situation holistically, understand its complexity.
Right.
It's the best decision for the people that are following you. And not that everyone will agree, but inspiring people to trust that decision.
Right.
And I think what we've seen in this time is examples of good and bad, or leadership that could be much better than what it is. Building on some of the things that have been said, what we've done as a firm, that same human-centered lens with our employees, is being hyper flexible with things like work hours, and with our bankers who hours may be cut, who aren't going in as we close down or close banks for the time being, still making sure they're getting compensated. Thinking about how we show up responsibly for individuals. It's, again, we're still in a very much so humanitarian type of response. We're still it's still a humanitarian challenge for many of our customers and the communities that we serve. How are we sensitive to the human experience,
Right.
Both with our customers, our employees, and the communities that we serve,
Right.
and making decisions based on that human experience that people are having, and it is fear, and it is financial instability, and it is anxiety. It is. I have two toddlers that may burst in this room at any second now. It's being sensitive to the challenges parents like myself that we're faced with, and being accommodating to those challenges, understanding them while still pushing forward and growing. So it's also a balancing that complexity and making the best decisions with the people who are following you in mind.
That's right. Let me add to that, because that's an excellent point, Mambu. You're 100% correct in that. I think in leadership, I think a lot of times we talk about, who's the smartest in the room. We're kind of trying to measure their IQ, right? We tend to think the ones who get up there in leadership are the smartest in the room. But Mambu said something that's 100% true. It's not how smart you are. Your ability to surround yourself with people who are actually smarter than you and better than you at what they are, and then empower them. That's true leadership. It's not so much turning the spigot off from an IQ perspective, but to what Mambu said, you got to really turn on the EQ, the emotional intelligence, right? Because your most valuable asset, in any organization, are truly your people. And we spend a lot of time talking about, looking at financial statements and profits and all that. I get that. That's very, very important. But those things are not possible if you don't take care of your people. If you you have the ability to enable, like Mambu said, remote work, practically like for us, a lot of us, literally overnight, your ability to do that. Are you able to provide, worksite essential employees with masks and gloves and hand sanitizers to do their job? Are you offering life balance? That people are dealing with this, completely different. And again, to what Mambu said, we're all at home. So our kids are dealing with this, we're dealing with this. And how are you able to emotionally respond, to that? Really, I think highlights what true leadership is.
That's really great responses from both of you. So you're kind of touching on this human aspect that we kind of have to consider. And in that same vein, there's that saying that crisis really brings out people's true colors, that you can see both the best of humanity and the worst of humanity. Right. So kind of branching off into that, I was hoping either of you could talk about a time where you witnessed really good leadership in crisis management, either in your current roles or in roles that you've had in the past. I know, Hansford, you mentioned travelers under Hurricane Katrina or things like that, but, really speaking to, times where you witnessed effective management during a crisis and things like that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, because again, I'll jump in if that's okay, Mambu. Because again, the industry that I work in, it's almost like we're responding, to crisis. You have to have leadership that is, has the ability, really to adapt, and I had the opportunity, this is the two things now with, I think it was back in 2017 or 2018, forgive me, where we had I think the storms there in your area pretty much, right? And that's our hub, and being able to respond, decisively to that. I had the opportunity to see that, with our CEO, and to watch him, do several things. Obviously, a very smart guy, very accomplished at what he does. But right away, how are you able to like reliably deliver, and what does this mean for us as an organization, right? Not and really communicating, and not being afraid to say what you really don't know and how we're kind of get through this. But again, being able to connect at the human level, as what Mambu said, to all our employees. We have 30,000. Some of them were impacted per se, and we're not going to wait, weeks to kind of respond, or even days to respond. We gotta respond right away. And with that also too, we have to kind of put our energy, our efforts, where our mouth is. So we were able to, connect with the local nonprofit organization there and do some things in the community to help kind of rebuild, families' lives. Right. And that was all at our cost. And not that that really matters, but things like that, practically putting things into place that we talk about all the time. And what that really does, it really galvanizes an organization, because again, a lot of people in any organization don't really often get to see, the heart in the hands, I should say, of an organization, unless you're in a role like what Mambu's, where you're actually doing that in the community. But when they see their leader and leaders respond in moments of crisis, that creates a level of loyalty, and you feel really good about kind of where you're working. And again, I was able to see that in two instances. The storms that happened there in the Northeast, and we're dealing it right now. Just watching how they're responding. Taking personal ownership for things. Obviously, our stock is dropping, but that's not the most important thing right now. It's all speculative anyway. Your ability to respond, how you respond again to your customers, to your communities, and your employees is critical. So I've had the opportunity to see it 2 times in 2.5 years.
I want to give 2 examples. I think we're talking about something that's really hard. Leadership is hard, but it's hard because it's more simple than we make it. I haven't been at the firm a long time. I'm relatively new to the firm, but I've been blown away. I've been impressed by leadership from our CEO Jamie Dimon and all of our managing directors, our executive directors down. The moment this happened, actually before it happened, we had travel restrictions, and we had phone calls from people on our national team just checking up on us. We can't overstate this human-centered lens.
Right.
You're going to hear us, if we're going to talk about leadership, that's what you're going to hear throughout this conversation. I don't think I've felt so cared for and seen at any other institution I've worked for. I mean, mental health services, childcare, the flexibility with schedule, the lack of pressure to perform even in crisis. It is, when you're in a time like this, there's the functional aspect of work of getting your work done. Then there's the actual human aspect of it, which, again, as I stated earlier, those worlds have collided. In between writing up a proposal or reviewing a strategy, I gotta go run and make hot dogs for kids, right? The kind of empathy and understanding that I've experienced here at Jpmorgan is unparalleled. And I've seen it, I've experienced it personally. And when I look at my colleagues across different lines of businesses, they're experiencing it too, unique to their functional role. And I think it's a testament to the culture that Jamie has set. And if you're human-centered, you're people-centered. If you're people-centered, you're culture-centered. And you focus on building a culture that's reflective of that human-centered lens. And I think that's what Jpmorgan has built. You may not see that in a press release. You may not see that publicly, but internally, it is the experience for a lot of employees here.
Yeah, just one thing to add to that too. I mean, Mambu, you bring up so many good points. I feel like I'm adding every single time. But one thing to add to that, to what Mambu said, I think one thing for you all to know, and it's again, it's going to be very difficult to keep it as a priority, but you always have to remember that culture does precede strategy. It has to, because the strategy and what you're trying to do, what your core competencies, what your, whatever differentiates you as an organization, whatever it may be, if the culture is not right, when crisis comes, it's going to crumble. It's not going to grow. So if you don't spend time really nurturing, that culture and creating that culture so that when these things happen, you can pivot, it's going to be very difficult. So again, I fully agree with what Mambu's saying, that culture has to precede strategy, and you have to be people-centric. And again, I'll say, I mean, the most valuable asset in any organization are its people. And in times like this, it really shows. And leadership really rises to the top in times like this.
And I would add, we say culture eats strategy for breakfast.
Right.
Or I've heard some people say culture eats talent for breakfast.
Yeah.
And that's absolutely true. That is absolutely true. The other point I was going to make is, again, when you have that lens and you're people-centric and you're caring about people, you're going to pick up a phone call. You're going to pick up a phone and make a call. You don't have to be the managing director to pick up the phone and make the call. Mm-hmm. I would argue the leaders are the ones who are checking up on people.
Right.
In your position now as a student or whatever your position is, you can pick up the phone and you can call your mom. Right? It's caring for people. Even if you're not the senior leader, call your senior leaders and check up on them.
That's right.
I guarantee you, it will differentiate you in a way that your peers won't be able to replicate, because they're not thinking like that. They're not thinking, what is the human experience my director's having? What is the human experience my professor's having?
Right.
And how am I oriented towards responding to them and their need? And their need might just be someone checking up on them. Right. Their need might be someone just a quick phone call. And I believe that's just as important as a leadership component, mm-hmm. as in a functional leadership role.
Agreed.
I'm really impressed with how you two each humanize at a very personal level, mm-hmm. two financial giants in America. Speaking as an undergrad business student, that's like, wow, you don't usually interact with anyone on the banking floor who's like that, period. So just a curiosity question I have for both of you. How long have you been working from home, and how's that going for you?
You want to go ahead, Mambu?
Yeah, I just mentioned the toddler who I have to worry about whether they're going to come in any minute now. So we've been working from home since the beginning of March. So we're rolling on now two whole months almost, mm-hmm. And it's been incredibly challenging. I cannot understate that. I have a 4-year-old and I have a 2-year-old. They don't understand work from home. Mm-hmm. They don't understand daddy's on a call, or it is. I am wearing multiple hats at the same time. Now, keep in mind, there's multiple hats being worn at work and in my role. Now, here are additional hats. It's been challenging balancing these additional demands of not just making meals, but again, providing emotionally for my kids, for my wife, and the tension of, I have deadlines and I have things that need to be done. Mm-hmm. So every now and then I'm hiding in the closet because I don't want to be found. Mm-hmm. Or they've bombed many Zoom calls. I think the beauty, the silver lining in it all is that we have a window into each other's lives, into our coworkers' lives, into a literal window almost, where we're seeing that. We're seeing, people in their physical home, what their rooms look like and what their homes look like. We're seeing their kids. I'm sure Hansford, your company's done similar things where people are sharing those stories throughout the day and like their dog. So there's this new level of like connectivity, the professionalism that I used to strive for. It's kind of like gone out the window. Yep. And it's okay. Yeah. It's almost like it's okay to let your hair down. It's okay to. I took a nap earlier today because I was, and not feeling guilty. I took a nap. Oh yeah. But
sleeping on the job.
It is extraordinarily challenging. But at the same time, there's some silver lining to it all.
Right. Wholeheartedly agree. I mean, just echo everything that that Mambu said. It's 7 weeks for me, going on 8 weeks. Same there. I think the first week of March we've been kind of work at home, and again we've had to really be again I guess we keep using the word the whole time, but just people and human centered, because again it's not that the professionalism kind of goes away, but you have to have a level of empathy, a level of heightened awareness and emotional intelligence, and you don't start every meeting just jump right in. You got to do wellness checks with people and how they're doing, and as a leader in an organization, I mean, your number one job is to train and develop the next leaders in the organization. So you got to know them beyond just the work that they do. Again, not to say know every single thing about their family life, but if you don't learn what really motivates people, what drives them, like what's important to them, to what Mambu said, you're seeing it now. You're seeing how people are prioritizing their time. And they're even more important as a leader, they're watching you and how you're prioritizing your time. And I think one of the mistakes that leaders make, particularly in moments of crisis, is they don't take care of themselves. And you hear it all the time. You jump on a plane, they tell you right away to put your mask on first before you help someone else. It's the same exact thing. So if you're not in a good mental space, and not just mentally, but physically, a couple things I've been doing a lot of walking meetings. So I've had to let them know, like, sorry, you're going to hear some noise in the background, but I got to get my steps in. I got to get, out of my seat and not sitting down all day long. And I encourage you to do the same thing too. So instead of having these, Zoom meetings, let's just do a walking meeting, have a conversation, and encourage one another there. I mean, we're doing things like a step challenge, like our entire organization. Everybody's on different teams and it's competitive, it's fun, but it creates this level of community within communities, but again, it's been new. I will say this one thing, although you still have 168 hours in a week, you still work, a lot, but it forces you to really have to think at some point, when we get back to normal, what are the few things that you're learning during this crisis that you're going to continue to do, right? And that's truly prioritizing, for me, family, because you can say that all you want and you say work-life balance. It's really life-work balance, right? Because I'm able to do a lot more, get a lot more done, be a lot more efficient. I've learned when I take care of myself, make sure others are taken care of, and I prioritize my priorities. And that's, that's my family, so a lot of new things. The hope is to take that into when we ever do, get to the point of just normalcy, to continue to do those same things. And to what Mambu said, make sure to keep other people accountable to the same exact things as well, to lead the way in this, not just talk it, but to lead the way in this.
That's actually really great. Yeah, go ahead, Mambu.
I love what Hansford just said. I think the idea that was landing for me that you just shared was how you lead yourself. Mm-hmm. I think often I used to think about leadership as, I have this team of people I'm leading, and it really starts with how I lead myself, how I lead my own life. And I think a lot that's what I was just hearing, and how I care for myself, all the things that we were talking about as far as empathy and caring and human-centered. I think that applies to the leader herself or himself. Mm-hmm. How do I care for myself? How am I empathetic with myself? And I think starting from the inside out it's how I've seen many mentors and many great leaders that I've had the privilege of working with grow their leadership skills.
Absolutely.
No, that's really great. My question, I think, branching off of that is, do you think that, after COVID, all these practices, these lessons that we've been learning, do you think that your organizations will try to keep some of them in place, or do you think we'll gradually return to, what was normal pre-COVID?
That's an excellent question. I think there's always a temptation to return back to kind of where you are. It's like, obviously gyms make a lot of money the first quarter, the first month of the year, because everybody wants to work out, eat good and all that. And the next thing you know, I don't know what happens, but the reality is we're paying close attention to this to see, not just measuring, bottom line and things like that, but the health of our organization. Because again, I think when you have disruption like this, it causes you to really think. Those that don't think, and don't really adapt over a course of time, you won't exist. So we see a lot of value in this. So as leaders, we're thinking about how do we integrate people back into the norm of maybe working in offices and things like that. There's a lot of theory around it. Do people really get work done when they're away? Well, I mean, productivity is actually up really high, and there's a good way to measure it because everybody is online. You can actually see it. So for us, I can't speak for senior leadership, but I know for the sphere that I'm responsible for, there's value, a lot of things that we're learning in this that we're going to keep. Again, the key thing we're talking about here is this human-centered approach. So it's not about theory anymore. This is practical application. So oftentimes you don't get the opportunity to practically apply, kind of what you've been talking about. And I think people get caught up in leadership. Number one, a lot of it has to do with the fact that you're really good at what you do. You have an elevated title, but you don't have any practical application and wisdom, around, the kind of things we're doing now. But you don't have a choice. You've been thrust into this particular situation, and you need to find a way to keep some of this going because there's redeeming value. A lot of things that we have going on. So long way to answer your question, but I can't see us just putting aside everything we're doing now. For us as an organization in the financial services and really risk management insurance, there's always this resistance against, not resistance, but we know we lag, and I'm just being transparent as it relates to work from home and things like that, because people love the human interaction. But work is getting done at a higher pace, even now, so we need to really think about this and give people autonomy in the sense of prioritizing their priorities and being with family. The things that we talk about, we got to put it in practice now.
I honestly think we've reached a point of no return. It would be a tragedy for us to go back to the way things were. Just practically speaking, we won't have a vaccine until a year from now, 9 months to a year or longer. Until that happens, we're going to be in this lifestyle of having to adapt and change. I think companies are realizing a lot of things. Do we need brick and mortar? If we're able to still be productive while people are home,
right.
Do we need all real estate space? Right. I think the sad part about some of this is there are industries and businesses being decimated.
Right.
I mean, I'll give you one example. We support small businesses, local entrepreneurs, with an emphasis on women, entrepreneurs of color, and vets. And just looking at what small businesses mean to LMI community or low to middle income communities, they're the backbone of those communities. The way and the rate at which those businesses are just being wiped out. We're still in the middle of if I could equate this to natural disaster, we're still in the middle of the storm. The dust hasn't settled yet, the smoke hasn't cleared, but when it does, There's no way we could be the same.
Right.
There'll be some people who are going to be picking up communities, geographic areas. They're going to be picking up the pieces and have to rethink what their neighborhoods look like. There are industries that once this is said and done are going to have to rethink what their industries look like and how to do business in their industries. We're still in the middle of this. I don't see us going back, not just in the way that we communicate, but the way that we think about business. I've been watching just the startup ecosystem. I mean, businesses that are going to come out of this, and are going to be ones that are really thinking long term. You know, I don't see investors investing in companies that are just like new hot thing. It's, you know, what's your long term strategy? What's your resiliency plan? We're working on an initiative. A lot of my work with the firm Corporate Responsibility is exploring and developing a strategy for what an equitable economic recovery looks like. And it has been hard to get that kind of insight. Something I encourage people to look at. I mean, you can easily look at, you know, reports Jpmorgan's putting out or McKinsey's putting out. No, it's some of the same things. But what few people are talking about is, you know, what does this mean for mental health and anxiety? Last time I recall, we were still dealing with an opioid crisis behind all of this. Right. So there are nuances, again, these complexities that as leaders we have to be watching. We can't just watch our own industry forecast. Right. We have to be able to take a step back and see the intersectionality of industries, the intersectionality of challenges. I'll give you a perfect example. Yes, we're looking at what the plan is to get back into office. I'm dealing with the challenge now. When we get back into the office, how do I go back to the office when I don't have childcare? And is it safe for my child to go back to school? Like, what does that have to do with my work? Everything. What does that have to do with productivity and growth? Everything. Right. So there's no going back anytime soon. I think once we get to going back, I can imagine the NBA opening back up. If I had tickets to the NBA finals and I'm in an arena and someone sneezes, like the pandemonium that would break out. That's just the level of anxiety that our world has right now. Right. And it really takes that human element into consideration as we think about how things are changing. We're going to create more damage than good, and it's sad to see leaders bumping up against that tension. I grew up in Atlanta. My family's in Georgia, and so when the state leader comes out and says we're going to open up things, I mean, damn, are you serious? Yeah. Are you? The pushback he got was really about his leadership acumen. Are you considering not just the economic impact? Are you considering the humanitarian impact? Right. I think that tension as leaders we're always going to have to balance and be able to really wholly assess. I can say this: more often than not, the more you lean into the humanitarian decision, the human decision, you may not be right all the time, but you'll be right more of the time than less.
I agree. Let me add one quick thing to what Mambu said in talking about the human-centered, and this is a quote from someone who I don't think was too human-centered, but excellent, like in one of the titans of business per se. But Jack Welch, said, when the rate of change inside an institution becomes slower than the rate of change outside, he said the end is in sight. The only question is when. So I think businesses understand, that the rate of change and what's happening in society, all these things that Mambu talked about that, might be tangential or maybe not directly tied to, your your business, you have to pay attention to things are going to shift and change. And if you're not going to shift and change, internally, you will cease to exist, period. So I don't think there's only one answer to this, that companies, including ours, are going to have to change in the way things are done.
Yeah. This is great. This is a great discussion, first of all. You're not trying to one-up each other, but like it's a constant tennis match, and this is great to watch. This is a question from Mambu, Hansford. Obviously, if you have any insight, go free to answer it as well. But you specifically mentioned you're building or working on an equitable economic recovery. I'm wondering, like, what's that about, if you can talk about that, and then like who you're going to for insights as to what this might look like or what people might want it to look like.
So I use this word equity. I'm speaking of it in a social context. As I say, there are people who, by the nature of how things are structured in this country, who are going to be left behind, who may be left behind. We saw it in the recession in 2008. So you all may have seen the latest research on who's being hit hardest by COVID, particularly Black communities, Black and brown communities, communities of color. And when you talk to people who are in communities, they'll tell you a lot of things that the world is seeing, they've existed long before COVID. Now it's just being amplified and exacerbated. So when you look at, just pick a gap, the digital divide, the wealth gap, the talent gap, right? Pick one. Those gaps are being exacerbated. When you look at a third, I use Michigan as a proxy. A third, it's believed that roughly a third of students in Michigan do not have access to the internet. That's roughly 500,000 kids. By the nature of how things are structured, those kids are either low middle income or Black and brown or both. Thinking about what recovery looks like with the most vulnerable in mind, with the often left behind in mind, is what that means. So another example, paycheck protection programs or relief funds. There are small businesses who are being left out. How do we ensure that those small businesses aren't being left out? How do we ensure the families who don't have access and opportunity to the resources that we are privy to aren't being left out of recovery? Because what we could see is increased inequality, increased inequity, increase of all these gaps. What does that mean for the future of the workforce? For the large number of Black and brown students who may not be able to go back to school because this was such a financial hit, an economic hit for them. And that's across the country. What does this mean for I said this earlier, neighborhoods, geographic locations, physical neighborhoods, things closing, buildings closing, mothers and fathers losing jobs. Like, there is a reality that for those of us who have the privilege of being able to Zoom and have the privilege, to work for companies that are going to support us, we have to be sensitive to that. For the millions of gig economy workers, your Uber driver who doesn't have insurance, who's not getting any of these relief funds, what happens there? We're at a dynamic crossroads as a country. I don't want to be political and talk about economic models, but we're at a really critical point where how leaders respond to this, to the equity aspect of recovery, will shape this next half century or longer. And again, the storm hasn't even settled yet. And when it settles, I mean, years of work, years of setting up systems and trying to build infrastructure in low to medium income neighborhoods are being unraveled right before our eyes. That's a reality that I sit with every day while still trying to think about, what's the strategy for economic recovery. When every day that goes by that I'm thinking about the strategy, more businesses are closing, more families are, there are lawsuits out right now because landlords are trying to evict families. So there's so much to unpack there. I don't even, this isn't a soapbox. This is the reality of what's happening.
Yeah.
And sometimes we just don't have access or windows into that reality as leaders. I'll say one more thing, and I'm excited to hear Hansford's perspective. I don't know if you're familiar with Brian Stevenson. He is a civil rights attorney, just phenomenal individual. If you've never heard him speak, look him up. He talks about the power of getting proximate and getting close to those who we may not ever be close to. And the power of getting proximate opens your eyes to a reality that you may not know. And I think that's important here. It's one thing to have a human-centered lens, but to go a step further and think about how do you get proximate to the humans that I see? How do I get proximate to these numbers, African-American disparities? What the hell does that mean? How do I get proximate to really touch and taste what people are experiencing? That will shape the way I think about my work, and it will shape the way I lead in a way that's deeper than just being a leader of a team. But I'm a leader of people, and I understand the situation and its nuances and its complexity.
Right. And, obviously this conversation is about leadership, and leadership is not about getting to the top of the mountain like by yourself, because if you do, it's pretty lonely like that. But leadership is really about how do you get to the top, and how many people do you bring along with you. That's critical and important. So what I mean by that is the communities in which we do business, for us to have enough cash flow to get through, the times that we're in now, where things used to be about, innovation and, revenue generation, and then it's kind of shifted to controlling cost, and then, really shifting also to health and safety. We're not able to contribute, part of the ecosystem in which we do business. We're going to fail. So again, from an equity perspective, we have to look at, the communities in which we do business, in which we live. How are we able to help them sustain? Again, everything that Mambu talked about, from education in schools to the things that we have access to because we're positioned to this. And again, we have enough cash flow to kind of do certain things. But if 80% of the businesses that we have, in America, are really 99% of the almost 30 million firms we have in America are small businesses. To what Mambu said, a lot of them are they don't have enough to exist. So how are we going to be able to truly define and be a part of that definition of what an ecosystem is? So I think it's inevitable. I think it's tethered together. And we call it at Travelers, collective prosperity. It's not just about us prospering. It's about every lever that we touch. Our customers, our clients, our agents, and making sure bore you with it, what we've done. But that's important, critical and important. So.
Those are both really, really great responses. Just a quick question, just a reminder before we continue for all of our participants listening in to the webinar. If you want to ask any questions, just leave them in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, and we'll reserve time towards the end to get those addressed by our panelists. Kind of still staying in the same the same vein about, how the pandemic has affected specifically minority communities and communities of color, kind of kicking it over to Hansford. So from your background in kind of human resources and your role,
Yeah.
kind of if you want to expand upon how the pandemic has affected and impacted these communities in terms of employment opportunities, and anything that you've kind of seen in your role thus far that can kind of speak to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's been very interesting, watching what's happening, in society, and we're seeing 22 million new cases of unemployment, and it's like, really, that's a lot. And again, I've juggled half of my career on the higher education side, so I like to say on the supply side of talent, and now I'm on the demand side of talent. Where we're kind of bringing the talent here. It's been difficult watching, this, because again, the skills that we would deem before that are not, it's, we would say it's not essential. That's not what you go to school to do. Yet we're seeing that with without those individuals, our country is in a very, very interesting space. So for us, and I know we're not there. I don't know if you asked this yet. What does that mean for interns? Particularly for you all. It's been difficult, kind of watching this. I know as an organization, one of the things that we were positioned well to do is to no furloughs, nobody's getting laid off, nothing like that. I mean, obviously we're hiring. We have over 900 different opportunities still available. But we have to be mindful, of kind of what we do. And of those 22 million people in new cases, some of them don't have those requisite skill sets for the roles that we have. So it's been very difficult balancing, the mindset of, business as usual. Yet, again, like I said, on the external, on the outside, you see all this stuff happening. I mean, we're part of this. We're not in a bubble because obviously we didn't have to furlough or any of that stuff. It does impact us. It really does. And more importantly, we think about you all who are in college right now, which is again, the next generation of leaders in our organization, and how are we able to contribute to that, is critical and important. So there's a lot, that, we're doing and that we're dealing with not right now, but I can say I'm fortunate that at our organization, we haven't had to respond in that way. And we have some workers, in different aspects of our businesses that do things that are contracted out, whether it's the food services, the gym and things like that, that we're going to be laid off because those organizations and companies could not sustain, that, again, like I said, in moments like this, in crisis situations, leadership has to be able to, I guess you would say, decide and make decisions with speed as opposed to, precision, matrix. It takes a long time to make decisions. And we were able to, again, financially stable to infuse, a couple $100 million into those what we call essential, so that those individuals would not have to be laid off, because we understand how important it is to our organization. So again, it goes back to the whole thing that we talk about, and I think all businesses have to kind of deal with now, that it's people over profits. I mean, I know it's a chicken and egg kind of thing, but truly it is. And again, we are not necessarily dealing with laying people off, but it's happening around us. And again, if we're going to be leaders and be part of this ecosystem, we can't just sit by and just watch and not do anything. So there's a lot that we've done. I won't bore you with all of what it is, and how do we respond to that? And we've been able to do a lot and get our entire organization involved as well.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Again, this is great. Just echoing Spencer's earlier reminder that if you do have questions, we're going to try to wrap this thing up around 7:30. So you're going to want to get them in before then at some point. Next question is for you work in corporate social responsibility philanthropy at JP. Have you seen or have you heard about how COVID is impacting nonprofits that might not be financially stable enough to stay afloat through COVID?
What's happening in nonprofits is very similar to what's happening with small businesses. It's probably a bit worse. People aren't necessarily inclined to give, and so we rely on donations. Mm-hmm. You close your doors, or I believe I mean, similar to like the small business space, your larger businesses, get the resources. That's what's been happening to nonprofits. In a prior role, I focused more on early stage nonprofits, building and growing early stage nonprofits, and the whole premise was how do you get funders, philanthropies, and companies to fund or invest in smaller nonprofits that don't have all the resources like a grant writer is, like the larger nonprofits. And those nonprofits are the ones in communities that your mentoring programs are in schools. They're really having the kind of impact that we want nonprofits to have in neighborhoods. They're closing doors. They're figuring out how to do this in a different way. So they're being just as decimated as the small businesses. It's not even worse. I think on the funder side of things, capital is being mobilized to support some of those smaller nonprofits, but the nonprofit space is going to change. The challenges nonprofits are going to have to begin addressing are going to change. Many nonprofits weren't really tech enabled the way they have to be tech enabled in today's COVID world. It's how do you pivot your programming to make it virtual, to make it tech enabled? Many nonprofits required face-to-face touch, and now that you can't have your program, now that you can't do that, what does programming look like? Your profits come from galas and fundraisers. I don't know what a virtual fundraiser looks like. I'm attending one, I think, on Friday. On Thursday. So there's all these things nonprofits are having to navigate, same way other companies are having to navigate, and they're unfortunately they're feeling it too, because there's just not the kind of capital that's flowing in the space that they need.
Right. I think one thing to add to that, although my work is not directly related to nonprofits, but we do work with education. We have public, private, types of programs specifically to create scholarships and to kind of close the education gap, within underrepresented populations, first generation students. So we've had all these conversations, with we have all these scholars, like 100 of them all throughout the United States at different schools. And when COVID-19 hit and universities were faced with, okay, like, what are we going to do? Again, not that they couldn't respond as fast, but I would assume they probably weren't able to respond as fast, maybe as some, corporations were. We started thinking about having conversation around, some of our students who were already very low income. And when you're closing down, the campus, and some of them don't have anywhere to go, what are you gonna do? So again, we had to respond to that, and we had to kind of push funds, towards that. Again, it goes back to, you say all these good things when times are great, but it's what you do in times like this, to I guess you would say substantiate, kind of what your core beliefs are, so again, not so much it's nonprofit, but again, I think there's a lot of universities that are, quote unquote nonprofit, but we've had to respond to as well, and making sure those last dollar kind of, grants, and more importantly, just money to get to those students to make sure that they're taken care of and they have, a roof over their head, and food to eat. So it's affecting, all around. So.
That's really great. We have a one of our first questions we're just going to ask right now because it's on the subject of nonprofits. This question comes from Jolie. She is an undergraduate student at NYUDC. What advice, if any, would you give to someone who wants to create a nonprofit right now to help a target group affected by COVID-19? Either of you can answer this question based on your experiences.
So most of my career has been in the nonprofit space.
Mm-hmm.
and I've worked really closely with executive directors, and I always ask people, why do you want to start a nonprofit organization? Because there's a lot that you can do as a social entrepreneur. There's a lot that you can do to impact. What is the value of organizing, of becoming an organized 501c3? I think just thinking through, like, does that have to happen? And will the legal entity, does that add a particular kind of value to what you're trying to achieve? I would also add, thinking about, if yes, then I would also add, how do you create a nonprofit that is relevant in these times? Meaning, how are you leveraging technology? How are you digitizing or virtualizing your program or your work? We are in the age of, I think we're entering the age of really unique collaborations, cross-sector collaborations, public-private partnerships. How are you thinking about who you can collaborate with, who you can build power with, build momentum with, and build together, build with other people, build with people who have a similar vision for change that you have.
Right. Yeah, just to kind of add to that, I think it's similar to what Mambu said. I love the fact that, people are wanting to respond, who have the means to create, I don't know, social enterprises or nonprofits, to respond to this. But, one of the things that I deal with, in Hartford and the different cities, that we do business, is that there's so many nonprofits out there already, that already exist for things like this. And, again, not to discourage starting your own, but maybe not at 10 times out of 10 times, there's one that already exists that does something very similar. So I would encourage, that individual to actually strengthen, those nonprofits. I've learned, you just learn so much, in the risk. I'm not saying you just want to mitigate risk and start your own, but sometimes that take a very long time. Are you able to even respond in the moment to make it happen? When there's already a nonprofit that already exists, jump on board, roll your sleeves up, see what they need, and in the process, you'll be amazed how much you learn. And sometimes that is what kind of sparks you to kind of create your own, or who knows, But I would say in moments like this, when the speed of response is much more important than anything else, I would strongly recommend and encourage a lot of you to think about strengthening existing nonprofits as opposed to starting your own.
Anything else, or?
Yeah.
Okay. Next question we have is for Hansford. You mentioned your ties to the education sector, Yale, Wake, UF, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
Do you envision that educational institutions going forward are going to survive this? Like, there's a lot of talk about a lot of money being lost, and a lot of programs being cut. So just education across the board.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and it's hard to say because education across the board it's not the same across the board. There's universities like I worked at, Yale, who have endowments the size of, I don't know what. It's public record, so you can see it. And even like NYU, a phenomenal school that has a huge endowment to sustain themselves, but the majority, won't be able to. There's a lot of universities that depend, on like the revenue that come from, number one, from people who are going to school, but number two, from sports, that won't probably exist, So because of that, not just the school, but different sports and different, I guess you would say, things within the school that students have access to are going to be cut. So yeah, I mean, there was already this conversation around the model, of higher education, and a lot of, schools that just weren't cutting it, even as great as our economy, as high as it was, I should say. So now, given where we are right now, yeah, I think that's it would be silly for people not to think that those, university is going to cease to exist. It was already happening to a lot of different universities, but again, you guys picked a phenomenal school. So again, I can't speak to exactly, what's going to happen there. But yes, to answer your question, I believe the higher education landscape is going to change quite a bit. There's already been a lot of discussion around just the growing cost of tuition, let alone the higher education debt incurred, with students. We're going to have to really think about this. Again, I worked in it for 10 years. I understand the model. I understand why it is this way. Do I think that it has to be, the costs need to be so high? Probably not, but we have to kind of rethink some things. So just like we have to rethink, in higher education or corporate America around our business model, I think it's going to hit, universities and colleges and small universities or community colleges even harder, who depend, on state and, federal funding. They're not going to have that. The ones who don't have the large endowments, I don't think they're going to make it. And it's unfortunate, but that's the reality. And if they lack the ability to, again, respond quickly and move things to, online like this, it's going to be very difficult to justify, what you're paying for, let alone even exist.
Great. Thank you so much for your response, Hansford. We have another question, this one coming from our chat from Grace Foster, another Stern EMBA student. So her question kind of goes back to the discussion of, different communities and identities being represented in the conversations regarding the pandemic. Specifically, it's how do you see the Asian community being included into diversity and inclusion conversations moving forward? You obviously touched upon Black and Brown communities and how they're being impacted, but this is a community that obviously doesn't there's a strong misconception that they don't face a lot of discrimination or barriers in the workplace, and maybe either of you could speak to that.
I'll let you tackle that first.
So can you all hear me clearly still?
Yep.
So in my prior company, I led our diversity, equity, inclusion work, and our racial bias training. I think the work that needs to be done just around bias, around kind of the language that we're hearing, particularly from our leadership, our senior leaders in the country, it reflects a level of ugly truth that I think we're going to have to wrestle with, like during COVID, outside of COVID. I think there are bias and racial biases that exist, that really getting at the deeper bias is how we're going to really have to approach this work. It is the same thing I shared earlier with what we're seeing in Black and Brown communities. Those challenges existed pre-COVID. And I think what Grace is showing, those are things, stereotypes and biases that existed pre-COVID. I think as we look at things going forward, there are work and work streams that we shouldn't forget. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is still important. What does that look like in the COVID environment? It looks like being sensitive to people groups that we're leaving behind, that we are stereotyping and being, quite frankly, inevitable or losing my train of thought. But the point of it is a lot of what you're saying, Grace, existed before, and how we get at the implicit bias, where is that rhetoric coming from, and how do we support leaders who are about bringing people together? How do we support leaders who are about going a little bit deeper than just your DEI initiative, but getting at the bias that has existed because of institutional racism? And institutional racism wasn't just against Black and brown people. But before I go down a whole rabbit hole, I think there's a whole just ideology around bias that needs to come through as we think about life now and going forward.
Absolutely. So two things, and thanks for that question, Grace. You're right. I think this, COVID-19 has, exposed a lot of things. We've been talking about business and whatnot. And, we're talking about leadership here, and it's never good that at the top in leadership to, in moments of crisis, not take like ownership. It's never the time to kind of point fingers at particular people or vilify, somebody in the organization and blame them or something like that. That's not what you do, in moments of crisis. So number one, to me, that's not good leadership in any company, in any form, shape, because I think, again, one of the things that you do in moments of crisis is you gotta take personal ownership. The buck kind of stops with you, and you don't vilify individuals. I think your question was around the Asian and Asian American communities and being kind of grafted into this general conversation around diversity and inclusion. And it's interesting because I have this conversation quite often, at my company. You're right. Historically, when we talk about D&I and diversity and inclusion, it started out, race, ethnicity, but purely black and white, because again, the history of our country, it's always been that, and then obviously with, and that was coming out of, Reconstruction and whatnot, civil rights movement, and then it became, gender, and that's a huge thing, or LGBT. I tell the folks, the Asian American and Asian diversity network, we call like the ERG in our organization, is just like those particular marginalized groups, stood up and spoke, and from their positions of leadership brought awareness, to individuals who are in power. I challenge them to do the same exact thing too, right? Because again, you're right. There's a lot of misconceptions. There's a lot of discrimination, and particularly in our country, as it's growing, more and more. And you look at birth rates, you look at our current, demographics of the United States. I mean, by 2050, there won't be one particular ethnicity over 50%. So, and that scares some people, but the reality, that's the reality we're dealing with, now. So I think to your question as it relates to corporate America and in being more inclusive in the way we kind of define diversity and inclusion, we have to kind of bring that in there. And those who are diversity practitioners have to not drink, the water, that bias, in the sense that it's just black and white or just female and LGBT. There's a growing population, Pan-Asian and Asian, that they're discriminated against for certain reasons, or there's certain stereotypes, about it. But I challenge them, we have to speak up. We have to make that part of the natural conversation as much as we possibly can, because I don't think it enters the mind of the average person, in America. But the reality, it's a growing population. By every metric you look at, whether it's graduation rates, in high school, college, contributing tremendously, so we got to put that out there. So again, I know we're, didn't want to speak too much to that, but I hope I was able to kind of speak to your question in the sense that, it needs to be something that we need to bring it to consciousness and have a conversation and educate people. Again, not to say that people are out there trying to find a way to marginalize and put their thumb on individuals, but the conversation is awfully around, black, white, gender, women, whatever it may be. And those things are critical and important. The funny thing about it, we haven't even scratched the surface of that, but we have to make and bring this into the conversation. Again, I don't want to take the light off of what we're dealing with here, why civil rights and all that stuff kind of started. But the reality is we're growing as a country, very diverse. And if we're not able to have these conversations and educate one another and kind of temper down these microaggressions and or prejudices towards certain people, it's not going to get any better. So thank you for the question.
So we have, do you have anything else to add?
No.
Okay. So we have a question from Vicky, our dear friend and advisor, and she has, quote, called both of you such awesome human beings. And she would like both of your insights on a question focused towards your studies, like at any point during college or later, even in the EMBA or graduate schools. So question from Vicky, what was the best decision you ever made as students?
As a student?
Yeah, as a student.
Take that first, Mambu, or you want to go? It's right on my tongue, so.
Best decision as a student.
I would say, let me answer this. So my undergraduate study was finance. I was good with numbers. I love numbers. I like to believe that numbers tell a story. I mean, numbers don't lie. People do, but numbers don't unless you kind of fudge, if you know what I mean. But I loved it. It came easy to me, and I wanted to do that. I saw myself growing up, single parent home, all that stuff. I actually grew up in St. Paul, went to school in Gwinnett County. Mambu, I think you're from that Atlanta area. I thought it was great, but the reality is I made the decision when I graduated from college, like, man, I love, the idea of putting on a suit and working Wall Street and all that good stuff. But I thought, that's not what I want to do. I want to understand what is it that really drives people. If I can understand human beings, doesn't matter what I do, I'll be successful. Because at the end of the day, as a leader, and we're talking about leadership here, your ability to influence people and truly get to the core of who they are and what's important to them, it's not, some model or some, P&L state, whatever it may be. I get that. But understanding what motivates them, what drives them was critical and important. I think the best decision I made in my education was to study anthropology, intercultural studies, religion. I studied that, for a whole year at Fuller Theological Seminary, because I wanted to get an understanding of the world we live in, people's beliefs, what drives them, what motivates them. So regardless of whatever I go into, which I went into education, I have a way to kind of build a bridge with, it doesn't matter what you believe, what you think. I know enough about, a little bit enough about who you are to connect with you at the human level. And that is a transferable skill in whatever industry that you go into. And I wish people would pay a little bit more attention to that and study those types of things. Self-educate, read, understand people, different gender, whatever it may be, ethnicities, culture, norms. Study that and watch it make you a much better and well-rounded leader. That was the best decision I made, to just forego the finance. Love it. I'm kind of back in it now, but to study anthropology and education. I use it every day.
So, Hansford, sorry, this is a personal side.
You're on mute.
Mute?
Yeah.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yep, I can hear you now.
Quick sidebar, Hansford. Did you say you went to school in Gwinnett?
Norcross High School.
Wow, I went to Meadow Creek.
We'll touch base after this.
Yeah, wow. Tiny world. Look at that.
Yeah.
We're literally next door to each other.
Mm-hmm.
I think the best decision I made, similar to Hansford, to his response. So my undergraduate degree was behavior analysis. I had this whole plan on going into the behavioral science space. I was in a kind of a pre-PhD program after undergrad, and I left. I kind of had a clear path getting into grad school, and I left and I went to go do like community work back home in Norcross, Hansford.
Yeah.
So the decision to take the path less charted, to create my own path, and not having the answers was hard, but probably the best decision I made. If you told me I would be, 10 or so years later, working for the largest bank in the country, doing what I'm doing now, I couldn't tell you that. But all of those small decisions that were really hard, that were staying true to myself, staying true to the impact that I wanted to have on the world, not just the job I wanted to have, but I made a decision based on the impact I wanted to have. Every time I've made decisions like that when it came to school, I I hated it at first, but being at the age where I can look back and say, you know what, that was the right decision. Probably the best decision I've made.
Great question.
Thank you both for those responses. They were actually really inspiring. As for a lot of the people who are still in school, who are tuning into this webinar, I think there's a lot to be learned from your decisions. But kind of just like, you know, as a last question to take us back to really the business world being conducted under our current conditions. Do you think, this is for both of you, do you think that, you know, teleworking is the future of business globally? Do you think that companies will realize all the money that they can save from not having as many, you know, in-person operations? Or do you think, you know, on the other side of this, once, you know, these stay-at-home orders have been lifted and, you know, people are, you know, gradually coming back out of their secluded environments at home, do you think this will re-energize us, you know, to go back to work, to go back to school, to go back out, you know, and see people? Like, how do you both foresee this going forward in a future sense?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. You want to take a stab at it first?
I'm laughing because I can't wait till like the office opens back up. I think you'll see more telework. I think you'll see more people working from home, especially, you know, even after things open back up. I think you'll see that. I think there's just a natural tendency to be with people.
Exactly.
And this is just my own person. Maybe it's my bias. Maybe it's more biological. But I feel it's a natural tendency. I'm frustrated that I can't grab a couple of my teammates and whiteboard through some of these problems. I personally thrive off of face-to-face connection. I think we'll have more virtual, but I can't see it being exclusively virtual.
Right.
Just to bring it in context of leadership. Leadership, you know, at the highest level, there are technical skills that will get you to a certain level, but at the highest level, it's about relationships. And relationships can happen virtually, but connections are much stronger when you meet in person. And I think for leaders and for leaders of companies, that personal, physical is going to still be important.
Absolutely, I agree. I think as human beings, we're created, you know, like for community. I don't see how we're going to just go back to a secluded, like, I mean, people are losing their, just being quote unquote sheltered in place. We need that human interaction. So I don't see that going away. I do, though, see that companies are looking at, again, just hear me out, from a nonprofit or for-profit perspective, you're always thinking about, controlling costs. And I think Mambu talked about this earlier, brick and mortar. Like, do you really need to have so many buildings that are like 50% capacity? Do you need that? Like, what else could you be doing with that? You could, pay people more or hire more people. That, and I think also too, I think it's going to cause companies to really pay a lot more attention to this gig economy thing, where young people or people in general are, look, man, it's like a contract. It's not that I don't care for the traditional type of work. When I have a particular skill set, I'm really good at it, and I want the autonomy. I want my own darn time, and I don't want to have to do this and do this and do that. I think it's letting companies know, that you're gonna have to pay attention to this, and you're gonna have to think of a way to implement that, and it's gonna be very interesting, with your generation, particularly you all who are on this call who are seniors or even juniors. You're being affected by this. The way you see the world is going to be uniquely different. My generation per se, I'm 39. I mean, I was in college when 9/11 happened. I remember everything about it. I remember 2008, 2009, I was working. This is your moment, and the way the world and business world respond is going to be unique. We have to adjust and to respond. I don't think it's going to go full straight, like, virtual type of thing, or all the way back to brick and mortar, but we're going to really have to think through this, How do you, obviously people need that human interaction. I think as a leader, you need to, engage for impact, not like you're about to hit something, but engage to impact people. But also, again, balancing life-work balance, you have to really think about this. So excellent question.
Great. Thank you both for your your responses to all of our questions that we've asked you tonight, and for joining us for this panel discussion. I believe we had one question that was entered in the Q&A, but we're going to try to answer that separately from that. But thank you both for joining us this evening. Michael-Scott, if you want to say anything as well.
He's on mute.
Michael.
This was great. This was totally worth my time. I was like, oh, an hour and a half?
At least you're on it. Yeah.
But yeah, thank you.
No, thank you both.
Yeah, and then I'm sure we can, connect either of you to any of our panelists who are interested in, speaking to you further. But for now, I'll turn it back over to Vicki.
I just want to say thank you again. This was a marvelous and very profound conversation. I'm feeling better, especially about corporate America, knowing you both are there. So thank you. And this is our last meeting of leadership panel. We're going out on a super high note. So be well, NYU DCers all, and Hansford and Mambu, thank you so much again. And Michael-Scott and Spencer, fabulous questions, gents. Nicely done.
Thank you, Vicki.
Thanks, everyone.
Stay safe.
I hope.
You have a good night.